Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and all the better for you've joined me for part 4 of our story tonight. And what a fabulous story it is too. You know, there's a blizzard blowing in Alaska, everything is icy cold, it's Christmas, a Bigfoot is lying sick in the barn, and we're going to find out what happens next. So let's continue with our story.
I think I should warn you, Karen dear. If your grandmother knows I've let you out into the blizzard again, she'll probably never speak to me again. So we need to be very discreet. We don't want to make a noise or draw attention to ourselves, because we can hardly tell her that we went out into the snow again to look for that piece of tinsel. She'd do her nuts about that. Are you sure, Karen, that you want to embrace the elements with me? I can easily go out and see if the little Bigfoot is all right, and give him some more medications and food. There really is no need for you to accompany me, you know.
I want to come with you, Grandpa Elk. I don't care how bad it is out there. I've seen a lot worse, you know, and even though the wind is feisty, the barn is so close to the cabin, so it won't be a problem getting there. I've also got some food for the Bigfoot that I discreetly put away last night after dinner, so that Granny Dora couldn't see me.
Well, you're a clever little thing, Karen, you are, said Elk approvingly. I rather thought you'd want to come with me, and I can see why. I also believe the little Bigfoot will appreciate your presence. I think when he saw you in his groggy state, he was comforted by your young energy. But make sure you dress warmly. We cannot let your grandmother see us, or I'm a dead man, he said, making a gesture of a slit throat, which made Karen giggle.
Don't worry, Grandpa Elk. There's nothing to worry about. She's far too busy preparing Christmas lunch and listening to Christmas music to notice us slip out of the cabin.
Well, I hope you're right, said Grandpa Elk, gesturing for his granddaughter to follow him. He opened the front door discreetly. The wind practically throttled the both of them unrelentlessly, whipping against their clothes unabashedly and toying with their ability to wade through the snow. But it would seem determination and cast-iron grit can make you overcome the greatest of obstacles. The snow was beating against their faces rather like a sandstorm in the desert. It was stinging uncomfortably and burning their skins. The cold crept through Karen's gloves. It was almost unbearable for her, but she knew the little Bigfoot needed their help, and how could she possibly enjoy Christmas in the cabin when she was worrying about the poor little mite all the time? The little Bigfoot was all that consumed Karen's every thought. Even Granny Dora had commented about how distracted she seemed all morning. But how could Karen tell Granny Dora about the Bigfoot nesting in the barn? For her grandmother would tell her to leave it be. Karen knew as she made her way through the snow with her grandfather at her side that this would be a Christmas she would never ever forget. For their unusual, very special visitor lying in the barn had turned Christmas over on its head for them. Karen's heart pounded vigorously in her chest as she and her grandfather very discreetly opened the barn door. Not knowing what they would find, Karen sighed with relief when they were surrounded by the 4 walls of the barn, and had left behind the wailing wind that was causing everything to rattle. Karen was almost afraid to look at where the Bigfoot was lying in the far corner of the barn. She was so desperately scared the poor little mite might not have lasted the night. She closed her eyes tightly, almost afraid of what she might see. She took in a deep breath and looked towards the far corner of the barn. The little Bigfoot was lying there motionless on the floor. He looked like a black woolen rug. For a moment Karen and her grandfather Elk feared the very worst. They were certain the little Bigfoot was dead. Grandpa Elk put a comforting, rather reassuring arm around Karen's shoulders as they reluctantly, somewhat warily, approached the little Bigfoot. Be strong, love, her grandfather whispered. Remember, we did our very best for him in the circumstances.
Karen knew by her grandfather's ominous words that he really believed the worst, and that the little Bigfoot probably had not survived the night. She inwardly screamed, "Please, God, no! I'd give up all my Christmas presents for the next 10 years, I would, if you'd only save this little Bigfoot. Please don't let him die. Please, I beg you, God." Karen was the first to step forward very cautiously. She moved stealthily across the barn floor. She held in her hand the bag containing the food she'd bought for the Bigfoot. It was as she stood over the little Bigfoot's head that she observed the rise and fall of its chest.
The blanket had slipped down the Bigfoot's chest and was only covering a small portion of his body. He really did rather look like a black rag on the floor, and if you didn't know better, that is what you would have assumed he was. But the Bigfoot was alive. He was breathing. Karen wanted to punch the air with a joyful fist. Relief washed over her. She glanced up at her grandfather elk and whispered, "He's still breathing."
"Well, that's a relief,"
said her grandfather, stepping forward to examine the Bigfoot more closely. That was when Karen noticed not only had he eaten the ham sandwich, but the eggnog had also been drunk. And she knew if the Bigfoot was eating and drinking, it was obviously making a swift recovery, and that was indeed a promising start. All of a sudden the little Bigfoot shuffled awkwardly under the blanket, opening one eye and then another, as it glanced from Grandpa Elk to Karen. The little Bigfoot looked a tad confused for a moment, as if he was disorientated and didn't know exactly where he was, or if he was seeing right. So he rubbed his eyes and then looked at Grandpa Elk and Karen, with a very shy, demure expression on his face.
"It's all right, little one," said Grandpa Elk. "I'm not sure if you can understand a word of what I'm saying, but we're here to help you. We mean you no harm. We brought you some food and drink, and if I may, I'd like to give you an injection in your arm. It may sting a bit, but I'm getting some stuff into your body that will make you strong again, and I'm sure you want that for yourself so that you can find your parents again when the blizzard finally goes away."
The little Bigfoot must have understood exactly what Grandpa Elk was saying, for he stretched out his arm rather bashfully, but with an expression of expectation on his face. So Grandpa Elk injected him with the medication. The little Bigfoot didn't wince when the needle pierced his skin. It was like he understood perfectly that they were helping him. His dark treacle-coloured eyes, although reticently demure, seemed filled with an appreciative gratitude. Karen then opened up a bag, placing some food on the floor beside the Bigfoot, along with bottles of water. She passed the Bigfoot a bag containing some juicy sweet grapes. The Bigfoot accepted them gracefully and fumbled around in the plastic bag, pulling out a handful of grapes and popping them one by one in his mouth. He ate very politely, with his mouth shut. He stared up at both Karen and her grandfather.
"The grapes are nice, aren't they? I love grapes myself. They're one of my favourite fruits," said Karen.
The Bigfoot stared at Karen as it continued to eat the grapes, until finally he had demolished them all. But there was a spark of life in his eyes, which Karen knew meant the creature was doing so much better, and probably would make a full recovery. She could only hope that when it was strong enough, and the wind died down, that it could go off and search for its parents, as Karen was certain his family must be extremely worried about his welfare. The Bigfoot handed Karen the tinsel he had wrapped around his neck. It was probably his sweet way of giving her something pretty, to thank her for her help. So Karen accepted it from him graciously, with a warm, thankful smile. "We'll come back in the morning and see you're all right," she told him.
"We hope you get better soon,"
said Grandpa Elk. And then they hurriedly left the barn, glad to see that Granny Dora hadn't the faintest clue that they'd been out of doors. Karen and her grandfather were in a celebratory mood, for they were certain the Bigfoot was going to make a full recovery. So now the day seemed to have become infinitely brighter. The Christmas meal was, of course, absolutely amazing, but they wouldn't have expected any less from Granny Dora. And it was made all the more delicious when the weather calmed down and the rattling wind subsided. The icy cold, heartless blizzard seemed to have melted away. So Karen knew by the morning things would be infinitely better. The following morning Karen woke up to a winter wonderland, a much calmer, brighter day, and the views outside the cabin window were nothing short of spectacular. She was surprised to see a man wading through the snow, leaving behind a trail of pristine prints. He was making his way towards their cabin, with a backpack on his back. The man looked a great deal like Grandpa Elk, with a long wispy beard, and, of course, he was well built for a man of his advancing years. But then again, Alaskan men are usually well built. He walked with a strong deportment, but his weathered, heavily lined skin and piercing blue eyes made Karen feel absolutely certain this man was Grandpa Elk's age, or possibly even older. Who was this mystery stranger, Karen wondered? What was he doing approaching their cabin on Boxing Day of all things? Certainly if her grandparents had been expecting a visitor, they'd have made mention of it. Whoever was visiting them would have come here by bush plane. So this man's impromptu visit must have been purposeful. "Grandpa Elk!" she cried out to her grandfather, who was sitting on the couch reading a book, as it was early in the morning, and Granny Dora was bustling around, cleaning up some of the mess from the day before, as Christmas paper lay strewn all over the living room, along with a plethora of carcasses of Christmas crackers that they had popped. "Are you expecting someone, Grandpa? Because I see we have a visitor," said Karen. Grandpa Elk looked more than a little surprised. He looked up from his book he was reading. Puzzle lines stretched between his bushy brows. "A visitor? Good Lord, are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure, Grandpa. There's a man walking towards our cabin. He's brought along a backpack with him." Grandpa Elk sighed warily. He raised himself from the settee. He stumbled awkwardly over to the cabin window, to peer out of it, to make study of the curious visitor that had just arrived. All the while he tugged at his beard. Grandpa Elk suddenly raised a bushy brow and said, "Good Lord, that's Rick Sullivan. By Jove, what is he doing here of all things? He's never visited our cabin before. And he hasn't come along with his wife." Grandpa Elk looked slightly confounded to see his friend marching up to their front door. Karen's grandparents always appreciated visitors to their cabin, but they were few and far between, given they lived in such a remote location. Grandpa Elk looked up at Karen. "Remember the story I told you about Rick's fishing expedition? And how a Bigfoot helped him out with a fish? It's the same Rick Sullivan that I was telling you about. But what is he doing here? God only knows." Karen was now rather curious about their unexpected visitor, especially as this was the man who had an extraordinary encounter with a Bigfoot. And soon after Grandpa Elk had talked about him, now here he was at their cabin. Elk raised his voice to get Granny Dora's attention. "We have a visitor!" Elk called out to Granny Dora, who entered the living room looking somewhat surprised. "But are you sure about that, Elk? I don't think so. We don't get visitors in the middle of nowhere just rocking up like this. Your eyes must be deceiving you. No, we've definitely got a visitor. He's about to knock at the front door. Would you kindly answer it, love?" "But of course I'll go and get it," said Granny Dora, shimming over to the cabin door. She opened it very quickly, as Rick Sullivan was about to knock, and then when she saw him, she let out a surprised gasp. "Goodness gracious me! To think that you're standing here in our doorway, Rick Sullivan. This is an incredible surprise. The last time I saw you it was in Juneau. We certainly never expected a visit from you, but I'm delighted you're here. What a rare treat this is. You must come in." As to why Rick had visited the Wheaton family on Boxing Day, no one knew the answer to that question, for he was not forthcoming about his visit. Karen decided that this was the perfect opportunity for her to visit the little Bigfoot in the barn, as the weather had cleared, and her grandmother would not mind her going outside for a little walk, which is exactly what she planned to do. "I'm just going for a little walk, Granny Dora," she told her. "I've eaten so much delicious food over Christmas, and I'm stuffed. I guess I need some exercise to work it all off." When Grandpa Elk heard what Karen was saying to her grandmother, he gave her a wink. He was caught up in conversation with Rick Sullivan, but he knew exactly where Karen was going. "Don't wander off too far, love, from the cabin, I mean," Granny Dora warned. "We don't want you getting lost, do we? And out here in Alaska, that is very possible." "Don't worry, Granny Dora. I'm just going to be 5 minutes away. I won't be going far from the cabin, I promise." "Good, I'm glad to hear it, love," said Granny Dora appreciatively. There was a skip to Karen's step, as she hurried off breezily to the barn to see the little Bigfoot. She had, of course, come armed with goods for the Bigfoot, plenty of food for the little thing to eat. She was no longer filled with trepidation or anxious energy, for the weather now was so much calmer and significantly warmer, and no wind was blowing. Everything outside the cabin was crisp and clear, picture perfect, like the most glorious postcard you've ever seen. Karen opened the barn door rather cautiously. It squeaked behind her. She glanced over to the far corner of the barn, where she expected to see the little Bigfoot. Maybe he'd be looking up at her by now. But then she realized he was gone.
and she could not help but feel a desperate sense of disappointment. Of course she chastised herself for these thoughts, for indeed if the little Bigfoot had gone, it was a very good sign. It must mean he was fully recovered. But she could not help but feel a big vacuous hole inside her heart, as she had warmed so much to the little Bigfoot, almost as if he had become a friend. Karen walked over to the crumpled blanket lying in the far corner of the room, like a puddle on the floor. On the blanket she saw some twigs had been arranged in a Pacific pattern, and Karen smiled to herself. Even though she couldn't understand the meaning of the twigs, she knew they were saying thank you. As Karen walked away from the barn, with the blanket in her hand, her heart became heavy, because she was certain she'd never see the Bigfoot again. Rick Sullivan had been invited to stay with the Wheatons for the next few days. He had cordially accepted their invitation, but had given no plausible explanation as to why he'd visited the Wheatons, apart from saying he was feeling a tad lonely, as his wife had gone to stay with his sister, and he'd been left alone at his house in Juneau. He had come to the cabin by bushplane, with no advance warning, which in itself was decidedly strange and rather unorthodox. It was late that night, after everyone had retired to bed, including the Wheatons' guest, Rick Sullivan, and when they were all locked in a deep sleep, all of a sudden they were woken up to the sound of someone clobbering the front door very loudly. Whoever the hell they were making quite a commotion, so much so that the whole cabin began to shake. Karen woke up with quite the start, wondering if she'd woken up to an earthquake. She could hear Grandpa Elk telling Granny Dora that he'd go to the front door and see who was there. "It's probably nothing, love," she heard her grandfather saying in a reassuring voice. "It might even be the wind. You can't be sure, can you?" "Are you kidding me, Elk? There is no wind out of doors. Someone is literally shaking the entire cabin," came Granny Dora's panicky voice. "It sounds like the axeman is at the door. Please don't answer it, Elk, whatever you do," she begged. "I'm creeped out, Elk, I really am. A normal, civilized person doesn't knock at the door like that. It's insane. And who would be at our door at this time of night, when we live in the middle of nowhere? No, you can't possibly answer it." "Calm down, love. I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe it's Rick's wife." "Rick's wife?" said Granny Dora, sounding more than a little confounded. "You think Rick's wife is paying us a visit in the middle of the night like this? Are you absolutely insane? Besides, isn't Rick's wife spending time with her sister? What would she be doing here at this time of night, for goodness sake? And if that is her, why the hell is she banging the door so loudly? It's almost as if she wants to bring the entire cabin to its knees. Nobody should knock at a door like that. It scared the bejesus out of me, let me tell you. What is that woman thinking? She needs to learn a few manners, let me tell you." It was clear to Karen that, based on her grandfather's conversation with Granny Dora, that he was trying his level best to calm down stormy waters. He knew very well that Rick's wife was definitely not paying the family a visit at this time of night. Besides, no one in their right mind would take a bush plane in the middle of the night like this. But it would seem Elk's soothing words had reassured Granny Dora, for she seemed to believe that it really was Rick's wife at the front door. Maybe Granny Dora wanted to believe this to be the truth. Otherwise it meant that someone who was standing outside the door could in fact have evil intent, and Granny Dora did not want to entertain such disheartening thoughts, especially given she was so exhausted and overworked after the Christmas festivities, and wasn't in a hurry to get out of bed. "Will you sort that woman out? I'm exhausted, dead beat after Christmas, Elk," she said, pulling the blanket over her head defiantly. "I really don't appreciate people calling at this ungodly time of night, or knocking at the door so rudely. Why couldn't that woman have caught a bush plane at a reasonable hour?" "Don't you worry about a thing, love. Go back to sleep," said Elk. "I will get this." Karen followed her grandfather rather discreetly down the hallway. She didn't think he even knew she was behind him, for had he known this, he would have encouraged her to go straight back to bed. Who was at the front door, Karen wondered, at this time of night? She knew it certainly wasn't Rick's wife. The door to Rick's bedroom swung wide open. He was wearing a warm pair of blue and white pinstripe pyjamas, and wiping the sleep from his eyes, looking somewhat bemused.
"What the hell is going on? Who's making that wild commotion at the front door?" he asked. Luckily the pounding stopped for a brief moment, calming down the disturbed silence for a second. Grandpa Elk seemed wide awake by now, as if he'd been flung very rudely out of his sleep. He gingerly picked up his loaded rifle and cautiously made his way to the front door. The pounding started up all over again, so once again the entire cabin rattled. Granny Dora's voice called out, "For God's sake, Elk, let the bloody woman in, will you? I'd like to get some sleep if I may." Elk called out through the door, in a low, rather muted voice, "Who is there?" And there was a voice on the other side of the door that was far too muffled to hear clearly enough. It was Rick who suddenly said rather excitedly, "Open the door. It's my friend. It's my friend." Elk looked extremely puzzled at this, but he opened the door, and there, standing in the doorway, was a family of Bigfoot. Elk let out a gasp, for this he had not expected to see. Karen, who was standing behind Grandpa Elk, stepped boldly forward, as did Rick, who didn't seem at all fearful about the Bigfoots. All eyes stared at the Bigfoots as the motion-activated lights lit up their faces so clearly. The male Bigfoot spoke first. His voice boomed powerfully, and Karen heard the words translate into her head into clear English. "Makana tolabani, halila savono, kinatali banaka." It was as the Bigfoot spoke that she saw the two younglings standing side by side. The little female Bigfoot was standing next to a small male, but suddenly Karen realized that the small male Bigfoot, who was pointing at Karen and at her grandfather Elk, was the Bigfoot that they had brought back to health after he'd been very ill. He was saying something to his father. The big male Bigfoot looked from Grandpa Elk to Karen and said, "Malilatola, balina sagilato, havilana, consotila soko. We have come here to thank you for saving our son. Our son fell sick, got lost in the wilderness because of the blizzard, but you brought his health very kindly back to him with all your treatments and care. You gave him food to eat and water to drink. We are indebted to you for your great kindness and will never forget what you have done for us." The male Bigfoot had a bag made of animal skin slung over his shoulders. He fiddled around in it for a moment and then withdrew a stone which he handed to Karen. "Kantila sika, halilaka, kosampi. My son wants you to have it," he said. "It is very special to him, but you deserve it for what you have done for him." It was the most beautiful turquoise stone that Karen had ever seen. She could only wonder where the stone had come from, and how the Bigfoot could have come across something like this. At this point the male Bigfoot focused his undivided attention on Rick. No words were exchanged between the two of them, but Karen suddenly realized that a dialogue was occurring between them, but a telepathic one. She realized that Rick was well acquainted with the male Bigfoot, for he was nodding at him and smiling as if they were old friends, sharing a private joke together. Finally the Bigfoot family turned around from whence they had come and disappeared into the woods and were gone. For a long while, Karen, Rick and Elk stared out rather bemused at the snow under the dark canopy of the night, without saying a single word, almost as if all three of them were trying to digest what had just happened. Then Rick turned around and said, "By Jove, that was quite extraordinary, was it not? I'll tell you why I came to the cabin. I felt as if I'd been called here, for reasons I couldn't understand. But now it all makes sense. That Bigfoot wanted me to be here so that I could open the door, so that you would know that they imposed no threat to you." It was then that Grandpa Elk told Rick all about the little Bigfoot that had got lost in the blizzard, who was so sickly that he and Karen were not sure the thing would actually survive. But after plying him with medications, he had luckily made a full recovery. "That's incredible," said Rick, shaking his head in wonderment. "I don't know how that Bigfoot even knew I knew you. I told you to open the door because I recognized his voice at once. the voice I would hear in my head while fishing at the creek. What an incredible distance he must travel over. You have to admit it. All the way from the creek to here. It's extraordinary if you ask me. Well, it is a small world, is it not? My bet is those Bigfoots know every part of the Alaskan tundra. It goes to show Bigfoots must travel over long distances and over extremely treacherous terrain. Either that, or they know how to make significant shortcuts, how to access portals perhaps, or even wormholes, to get to places a whole lot faster than we ever could. I rather suspect that this may indeed be the case. It was the following morning over breakfast, as Granny Dora was frying eggs, while Grandpa Elk and Rick and Karen were seated around the kitchen table, knocking back glasses of orange juice and mugs of warm coffee. The kitchen smelt deliciously of caramelized toast and crispy bacon. Karen suddenly realized she was ravenously hungry. It was toasty warm in the kitchen, with the wood-burning stove spreading out its generous heat to all corners of the room. The crackling flames provided a comforting cheer. In the background, Christmas music was being cheerfully played. Elk, Rick and Karen just remained seated at the kitchen table, but not many words were exchanged between them. As Karen suspected, much like herself, they were all reflecting on the previous night's activities, for it's not every night when a family of Bigfoot pays you a visit. "Goodness gracious me," said Granny Dora, looking from Karen to Elk and then Rick. "Why is everyone being so quiet this morning?" "I guess we're all just hungry," said Grandpa Elk. "Well, good, I'm very glad to hear that. I've cooked up quite a storm for breakfast this morning, and we've still got so many leftovers from Christmas, I have to say." Granny Dora looked well rested after a good night's sleep. She was wearing a pair of chinos and a thick Christmas woolly sweater that was covered in Christmas reindeer. Once she'd served everyone up big generous plates of ham, eggs, crispy bacon, pancakes along with maple syrup. She sat down at the table with a mug of steaming hot coffee in her hand and said very reflectively, "I had such a vivid dream last night. You wouldn't believe it." "Really, love? Why don't you tell us about it?" Elk asked her. "Well, I'd like to, actually. In my dream, this whole cabin was shaking like a leaf. Someone was rapping very loudly at our front door, and I was very afraid, because it felt like a scene from a horror movie." "Goodness gracious, love," said Grandpa Elk. "That does sound grisly." "Well, it was, Elk. You have no idea. I was terrified, but you wanted to investigate the noise. I told you, Elk, to stay in bed and not to open the front door. I was terribly afraid that the person standing on the other side might have nefarious intent, for it made no sense to me that someone would knock at the door in the middle of the night when we live in the middle of nowhere, for goodness sake. Instead, you climbed out of bed and went to answer the door, refusing to listen to me. You would not believe, Elk, who was standing at the other side of the door. This is where my dream gets seriously weird. And I don't want you to laugh at me when I tell you what happened next." "I wouldn't dream of laughing at you, love," said Grandpa Elk, quickly chugging down a large glass of orange juice, as his whole body began to stiffen. Karen suspected he was now wondering how much Granny Dora had seen the previous night, but judging by the way she'd been talking, she really thought it must have been a dream. Granny Dora let out a big laugh. "Well, a whole Bigfoot family was standing at our front door. You were having a conversation with them. Can you believe that? There was a very big Bigfoot standing there. He was all male, testosterone literally oozing out of his body. Karen here was given a very pretty turquoise stone by this male Bigfoot, and then they left. They were gone. The dream was so very lucid. I've never had such a vivid dream before in my entire life. What on earth induced me to dream about Bigfoot? I mean, those things aren't even real, are they? But this dream, it was so lucid." "It sounds to me, love, as if you had a very strange dream last night. But I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss that creatures like Bigfoot exist out here in Alaska, because anything is possible." "Listen to you, Elk," said Granny Dora, chuckling. "You do have a vivid imagination.
Maybe Grandpa Elk is right, and creatures like Bigfoot do exist, said Karen.
Oh, I think there's a very big possibility they do, said Rick with a big smile. This is Alaska, after all. My guess is there are things out there in the wilderness we have no idea even exist. Well, you're probably right, said Granny Dora. But Bigfoot, I think, is a bit of a stretch of the imagination. Don't you? But let me tell you, I must have a good imagination, because my dream last night was so detailed in every way.
Karen and her grandfather Elk never told Granny Dora that her dream had been spot on, and that a family of Bigfoots had indeed arrived at their cabin in the middle of the night to say thank you. As far as Karen was concerned, that was the most memorable Christmas she ever spent in Alaska, and one she will never ever forget. She has turned the turquoise stone into a beautiful pendant that she regularly wears around her neck. People ask her all the time where she got it from, and she always says, "I can't remember," for some secrets are best not shared. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.